Hello and welcome to video number 2, YouTube video settings. In this specific video, I am going to point you the right direction to make sure that you know exactly what the recommended YouTube compression guidelines are so that when you render your videos, they upload to YouTube, then you'll get some crystal quality video and audio. So let's get started. Now, the last thing I want you to do is to get overwhelmed by the technical stuff. But let me just walk you through step by step. Basically, what they recommend that you do is basically export your videos as MP4. This is pretty much the standard nowadays, and we've moved from AVI files to MP4 files. And MP4 files are very compatible with like smartphones, Windows, Mac computers, and a lot of other types of operating systems. So this is pretty much the standard nowadays. Then audio codec, usually 96 K Hertz or 48 K Hertz is good. Now I'm going to actually go through Camtasia and show you kind of a live example of applying this kind of stuff to Camtasia. So if you are using Camtasia, great. If you are using a different video editing software like Sony Vegas or anything like that, you will need to just follow this. But if you go to Google and you just type in YouTube Advanced Encoding Settings, you'll get this page. But just rule of thumb, MP4 file, usually 96 to 48 kHz. And this is pretty much standard with Vimeo and other big video sites. H.264 is the standard video codec pretty much across the board. If you use Camtasia Studio 7 or 8, it is actually compatible. Frame rates, as you can see, for example, if the content is shot in 24 frames per second, then you should encode it and render it in 24 frames per second. So what they're saying is a lot of this has an impact on, for example, video like camera video recorder type stuff. If you're doing Camtasia, usually a pretty good rule of thumb is you can play around with it. You can do 24 frames per second, you do 30 frames per second. Usually 30 frames per second, usually as a rule of thumb, is typically good. Now, if you're using a high-tech camera and you've got 60 frames per second, then they're basically saying that you should cut it in half into 30 frames per second. Then we got bitrate. When you're rendering in Camtasia, you have two different ways to render. You can render as quality or you can render as bitrate. Now with bitrate, it tells you right here, like let's say for example, your videos are rendered as 1280 by 720. So 720p. They recommend the video bitrate to be 5000. And all of this stuff is going to make sense when I actually show you in application with Camtasia. And then you can apply that to any other video editing software that you want. But usually a rule of thumb in terms of resolution is 1280 by 720 is the industry standard. If you go 1280 by 720 and you want to decrease to 640 by 360, then that'll actually help, because a lot of people nowadays still have slower download speeds. They have DSL modems, or sometimes their internet is a lot slower. Now some of us have really, really fast internet speeds and want to be able to see HD quality. So this is industry standard. This usually is if somebody wants to watch it on their TV. So that's why this is a resolution that's recommended. But YouTube uses 16 by 9 aspect ratio players. So that's why you kind of want a wide 1280 by 720. But I would just stick with the rule of thumb. 1280 by 720 is usually the best way to go. Otherwise, if you don't follow this, what will happen is your videos will have these black bars, on the top and the bottom, or the left and the right, and it will actually not look as good. So in application to Camtasia Studio, you can actually see examples here. If I go to Camtasia Studio, and if I go to Produce and Share, we can go to the Custom Production Settings. Remember that the recommended type is MP4 files, and they recommend that here as well. So choose MP4. If you use Camtasia 7, then choose MP4. Click Next. So this right here is the controller for the Flash player. We don't really need that because we're dealing with YouTube. The size needs to be 1280 by 720. But keep in mind that if you're rendering by 1280 by 720, it needs to be rendered as 1280 by 720. If, however, let's say you render it and you record it as 800 by 600, you need to render it as 800 by 600. Otherwise, the quality will drop. Like, let's say, for example, that I recorded with 800 by 600. If I try to render a video with 1280 by 720, your video is going to look really, really blurry. You can't really go from small size to big size. You can go from a big size to a small size without losing quality. But just keep that in mind. Video settings, as you can see with Camtasia Studio 8, we can do frame rate 30. Bit rate, you got quality and you got bit rate. You need to choose bit rate. And remember, with 1280 by 720, if we go back over to here, 720p, they recommend the bit rate to be 5,000. So in this case, we'll just move it over till we hit about 5,000. Just keep in mind though, the greater you increase this, the bigger your file will be. But if you're uploading to YouTube, you know, they accept pretty big files anyways. Audio settings, you know, what I've found is with Camtasia, it doesn't really do it by hertz. So what I found in testing is anything beyond 80 and above, usually the quality of the video tends to be really, really good. So I like to stick with this, but I mean, feel free to play around with it yourself. And after that, you just click next, next, and finish, and then you basically just render that specific video. So that's in application to Camtasia Studio. It's obviously going to be different with different video editors. And if you ever run into problems, you can always find somebody either on Fiverr, on Odesk.com, or even Elance that will do it for you. Once you have the video settings correct, you know, you can begin to render it and upload it to YouTube. But obviously, before you do that, make sure that you watch all the videos in this video course so that you get the right keywords, you get the right LSI keywords to optimize it for Google so that you can increase your search engine ranking. So with that said, let's move on to video number 3 and talk about the keyword market research so that we can ensure that we're using the right keywords that are getting good quality traffic.